Today's daf is daf Samach Gimel. We'll pick it up where we left off yesterday. Omar Rav Yehuda, which is approximately 6 lines down from the top. We'll try to do a little bit more than a daf to make it a little easier for the fast day tomorrow. Sholach in Vayikra Yud Aleph, where the Torah lists the non-kosher birds, it says Shalach, Zeh HaSholeh Dogim Minayan. Apparently, it's a bird that notices fish under the water and dives down in order to take that fish. And duchifas, which is also listed, shahodo kofus. Hodo means the crest, the splendor of the bird is bound. Bound means like it's kind of like bent over. Its beauty is bound means that the bird has a beautiful thick crest of feathers that it can open and close, and when closed, it appears as though it's folded into the head and tied down. Tanya Nami Hochi, we learned to the Brisa, Duchafis Shahodo Kofus. Vizeh Shehevi Shamir Lebeis Hamigdash. It was this non-kosher bird that was responsible to bring the shamir to Shlomo Melech, which they used in the construction of the Beis Hamikdash, because the Torah prohibits using a tool, a metal tool, to cut the stones. So, in order to cut the stones and avoid using a metal tool, they used the stones with the help of an insect called the shamir that could crack hard objects. Apparently, it's a miraculous kind of thing. In any event, Rabbi Yochanan ki havi chazi shalach omar mishpatecha tohom rabba, meaning how great is the judgment of God that the fish in the water would be tackled by this bird called the shalach or shelach. Ki havi chazi nemola, when Rabbi Yochanan would behold an ant, and he would see that the ant is still so tiny and yet it has life and vitality, Omar, he would declare tzidkoscha kehari el. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. So God sustains even the tiny ant no less than the mightiest of mountains, the mightiest of creatures. Omar Meimar, lakone uvotne sharyon. Sharyon means miloshen shari, it's mutter. And these are birds which you're allowed to eat. However, shkanoi ubatnoi, which are very similar in name, but we're not exactly sure whether they're kosher birds or not, and it all depends. Mokum shenogu lechel ochlin, mokum shenogu shelo lechel ein ochlin. So the question is whether in a particular locale they have a mesora that this is a kosher bird. So the same bird might be eaten in certain locales, but not in other locales. So the Gemara doesn't understand this. So we're talking about a Doraisa. You can't tell me that a minog could override a lav Doraisa. So the Gemara sort of puts it into a slightly different context in lo kasha habi asher de shchiche peres faznia, habi asher de lo shchiche peres faznia. As we learned yesterday, if you find a bird that's not a dores and it has one of the simone kashrus, then you're allowed to eat it, as long as you know how to identify a paris and osnia, which are non-kosher birds. And in certain places, they were so far away from the wilderness that paris and osnia were never to be found. And therefore, they don't have to worry about identifying and being absolutely sure that this is not a Paris or a Znia. But in other places, the Paris or Znia would show up occasionally, and therefore you cannot eat these kind of birds unless you, even though they have one simon kashus and they're not dorsin, unless you can absolutely sure that you can identify it's not a Paris Vaznia. Omar Abaye, kue v'kakue asiri b'kakuasa sharia. B'marova malku iluye. So the case of a bird called the kui, or for that matter, kakui, which is probably like an onomatopoeia kind of thing. In other words, that's the sound that the bird would make. Anyway, in Eretz Yisrael, they would actually give malchus because it was not just a suffix whether it's kosher or not, but it's a vadai non-kosher. The korule tachvasa. They had in Eretz Yisrael a slightly different name for these birds, but whatever it is, those birds are identified as definitely non-kosher birds. Now, amongst the list of non-kosher birds in the Torah, there's something called a tin shemes. Now, the unique thing about the tin shemes is that although that's the name of a bird in one part of the Torah, but in another parak of the Torah, the same name tin shemes is used for a romes, a creeping creature. And that's one of the 8 creeping creatures that conveys tumah. Tana Rabbanon, tin shemes bo'us sheba'ofos. Now, the word bo'us has 2 possibilities. Either it's the Aramaic counterpart of tin shemes, or more likely, the word bo'us means the lowest. It's like if you listed all the birds, this would be like on the bottom of the list. It's, shall we say, it's a despicable or repugnant kind of bird that's bows, like a bat. This is before COVID. Right? How do you know that the word tinshomis is referring to the lowest and most repugnant of all birds? Oh, Eno Ella, perhaps you could suggest that Bol Shebishrotzim. It's the most repugnant of all creeping creatures. And the answer is because we're looking at the word timshomes in the list of non-kosher birds. And therefore, one of the 13 rules by which we interpret the Torah is look in its context. And in this list of non-kosher birds, where the word tinshomes appears, biofos, it's listing non-kosher birds. Afkan, and therefore we assume that tinshomes that appears in that same context is also referring to a bird and not to a creeping creature. And this is the tinshomes, that's the bows of birds. We're going to soon see that the tinshomes amongst the shrotzim is also bows. It's also the most repugnant of all creeping creatures. Tanya nami gabi shrotzim kai gavna. We have almost a mirror image brisa with regard to creeping creatures, and it says that tinshomes bows shebishrotzim. It's the most repugnant of all the creeping creatures. And it's called in English the mole, M-O-L-E, which probably belongs to the rat family. Ata omer bo shebishrotzim o enu el bo shebaofos, amrit sei lemad mi yud gimel midos shetor drestem davar lo minyono afkan b'meh hakos medaber bishrotzim afkan bishrotzim. So in its context, the tinshomes appears as one of the creeping creatures, and that's how we know that tinshomes in that parsha is referring to a sheretz, and it's the most repugnant, the bows of all creeping creatures. Amar Abai, bo sheba'ofos kipov. Now we were identifying the lowest of the low of the birds, which we said is either a bat or perhaps an owl. And now Abai wants to identify that repugnant bird as a kipof. Bo shebeshrotzim kur pedai. Right, the lowest of the creeping creatures is called kur pedai, which Rashi identifies as the mole, M-O-L-E. Omar Rav Yehuda, Kaos zu hakuk. When the Torah lists kaos as a non-kosher bird, it's what we call a cook. Racham zu shrakrak. And the pasuk also mentions racham, and that's the shrakrak. And the Gemara says that it's given that name because it has a squawk that sounds like a shrakrak. Now, in English, it seems it's called a magpie, M-A-G-P-I-E. Anyway, it has a certain shrieking sound. Omer Rabbi Yochanan, lo menikra shmo Racham, kevan sheba. This is an amazing piece of Gemara here, that the name of this non-kosher bird reflects the fact that it is the harbinger that tells us that is going to be raining, this rain that's going to fall. Sheba Racham Bo Rachmim Olam. When the Racham arrives, we know that the rain is about to fall. Omar of Bibi Bar Abaye, Behudi Yosef, it's not always so that just because the Racham arrives, we know it's going to rain. It's only if the Yosef Amide V'Ovid Shrakra. Two conditions. Number one, it's got to Yosef, it's got to sit. Yosef is Miloshon Leishev. And it makes a shrakrak sound. Ugmiri de Yosef ha'ara v'shorik osa meshicha. If, on the other hand, instead of sitting on something, it sits directly on the ground and lets out a shrieking noise, that's a harbinger that Mashiach is about to come. Shenemar ashrika lahem vakabtzim. The same word, ashrika, I will let out a whistle or a shriek and gather them in from the exiles. Pasuk in Zechariah Novi. Now keep in mind, not every shrakrak is reliable, because Omer of Adabar Shimi Lemaber of Idoi Ha'ahudi Yosef Bey Krocha V'Sharat. Right, a racham bird settled in a plowed field and shrieked. V'osa gol v'afskelemoche, and a stone came down from heaven and cracked its skull. Omolei hahu baidoi havi. That was a liar. No, there's such a thing as a racham or a shrakrak that is reliable and will honestly tell us about the Mashiach, and then there's a liar. How would you know whether it's this or that? I guess you have to see whether the Mashiach arrives or not. Torah Rabbanu learned in the Brisa Orev. Ze Orev. I mean, it sounds like, the Brisa is saying, pointing to a certain vulture and saying that's an Orev. So we're going to have to see what that means. Anyway, then the pasuk says, "Es kol orev," apparently a ribui in the word "kol." Lahavi orev ha'moki, ha'amki, some sort of a deep orev. We'll see what that means. Lemino is also a ribui. Lahavi orev ha'bo b'rosh yonim. We'll have to see what that means. The orev that comes with the heads of a pigeon means it has a head that looks like a pigeon. Omar mar orev ze orev. Otu kaman koi. Is there an orev standing in front of us that the Brisa says that's an orev? Ela ema, but rather reinterpret the Brisa to mean orev ze orev ukoma. The orev that the Torah is responsible for, which is kind of like the general orev, an unspecified type of orev, is the black orev. That's the common orev. And he says, and I think we touched on this maybe earlier this week, that the Orev is identified as a crow. V'cheinu omer kutzosov taltalim shchoros ka'orev. Right, this is Shir Shirim. His locks are curled black as an orev. Ha'amki chivasa, chivra. So what's his deep orev? That's the white orev. And apparently has light patches, and it's called deep because the white patch against the dark background appears deeper than the background. In the parsha of Mitzorah, it's deeper than the skin, meaning Kemara Chama Hamuka Minatzel. It's similar to the appearance of the sun, which is deeper than the shade. So a sunny surface gives the illusion of being further away than the darkest surface that adjoins us. Similarly, a white spot of taras on a darker skin appears sunken. The white orev is not completely white, but basically black, but have some light patches. Since these spots give the illusion of being deeper than the surrounding dark plumage, it's called a deep orev. This reminds me of Edgar Allan Poe. The Orev haba b'rosh yonim, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that it appears at the head of a flock of pigeons and it leads the flock, but rather eladidomi racial yon, it has a head that you can fool somebody. It looks like a head of a pigeon, which is a kosher animal. Ton rabbanan netz zanetz. Again, we don't know what that means. But in any event, one of the birds that is classified as a tamei bird is hanetz. And lemineu lahavi es bar chirya. That the word lemineu is a ribui to another extended species of the nets. Rashi identifies the hanetz as a sparrow hawk. As an added toe. My bar chira, excuse me, Omar Abaye, Shrinka. The word means a strangler. There's a shrike bird, otherwise known as a worker strangler in German. Its habit of impaling its prey of insects on thorns. Rav Yehuda Chasida, also listed amongst the non-kosher birds, Zu Daya Levana. It's a white daya. And daya is also listed in the non-kosher birds. Lamadikres Shma Chasida Sha'osa Chasidisim Chavrosera. Apparently, kindness, the Chasida shares its food with other birds of its kind. If Chasida is so compassionate, why is it stigmatized as a non-kosher bird? Apparently, it directs its kindness exclusively towards birds of its kind, but will not help any other species. Hanafa, a bird that we call Hanafa, Zudaya ragzonis, a hot-tempered daya. Lomanikre Shma Anafa, Shemina efesim chevroseha. It rages against its fellow birds. Amarav Esrim the Arba Ophos Tmeimim. Rav is of the opinion that there are 24 categories of non-kosher birds. We're going to have a lot of the sugya now to figure out how do you get to 24. Because actually in Vayikra there are only 20. In Sefer Dvarim there are 21. Well, either way, there's no 24. From whence does Rav derive the conclusion that there are 24? Ida Vayikra Esrim Hava. Ida Mishnah Torah in Sefer Devarim Esrim V'chad Hava the 21. So even if you want to take the higher number, it's 21. It's not 24. V'chi Tema, perhaps you can respond and say the following, that da'a d'chsiva b'vayikra v'lo ksiva Mishnah Torah, so the bird called a da'a only appears in Vayikra, not in Dvarim, shadye alayu. So we're going to take da'a, which does not appear in the 21 birds listed in Dvarim, and we're going to superimpose it and add it to the list of 21 birds, non-kosher birds of Sefer Dvarim. So da was left out of Dvarim, but we'll put it back in. And that will jack me up to 22. Akati, nevertheless, Esrin Utrain Avi, all we get to is 22. We don't get to 24. Amalei Rav Chizda says, Hachi Amar Avuah Imach Mishmei Derav. This is what I heard from Rav Hanan, the son of Rav, in the name of Rav, that's your mother's father, Limina, and therefore Limina with regard to Ayah, and Limina, which it says in Parshas, in Sefer Dvarim, Limineu, and we have in the context of the Orev, we have Limino in the context of the nets, we have the Limineu, Harekan Arba. In other words, we have different forms of the word lemina, lemina, lemino, lemineu, four times. To add, 1 second, we were up to 22, and now we're going to add 4. Is 4 plus 22 is 26. We got to get a 24. Ihachi esrim v'shisavi 26. Amar Abaye, I have to reduce 2 birds from the list, and therefore I'm going to say that da'a v'ra achasi, that the bird called da'a, which is mentioned in Vayikra, and the bird called ra, which is mentioned in Dvarim, are one and the same bird. And now we're going to have to analyze the logic of Abaye. But once again, we're at 26 and we minus 1, we get down to 25. We're still not out in the clear to the magic number of 24. And now Abaye wants to prove that da'a and ra'ah are one and the same. The tarte inun, if you can entertain the idea that da'a and ra'ah are 2 different species,